strategy to end the war.
We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. The war in Iraq is over, and we welcomed our troops home.
President Obama repeatedly touting the end of the war in Iraq as a foreign policy victory for his administration, that is, before this week. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Brit Hume, Fox News senior political analyst. Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press. Syndicated columnist George Will. And director of the Woodrow Wilson Center and former Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman. Brit, I want to pick up on my conversation with Congressman Chairman Rogers. President Obama is pressuring Maliki to form a unity government, but on the other hand, as we've been discussing, Maliki seems to be doubling down on a Shia base, both reaching out to the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who's calling for the Shiite militias to form, to Iran. How do you reconcile those two?
I don't think you can, and I don't think the objective that the president has set forth, while it would be very nice, can come about in time to save the increasingly dire military situation inside Iraq. It may be that the city of Baghdad won't fall, but it is clear that much of Iraq already has fallen and is in the hands of the most brutal kind of terrorist organization you can imagine. So the situation in Iraq that the president described in the soundbite that you played before we started here is now gone, forfeited in my view, by this administration and by Iraqi President Maliki, who is, a very ineffective and I think a weak leader who has made a multitude of mistakes. However, there's been no sign that this president has been deeply engaged with him, trying to prevent him from doing so. And I think that the leverage that we would have had we been able to keep a residual force there, would have helped him do that if he'd been interested. He seems not to have been.
Julie, is the White House this weekend busy pressuring Maliki to reach out to the Sunnis, to reach out to the Kurds, to form some kind of a reconciliation government? And what if that doesn't happen? Are they just going to let Maliki fight it alone? Are we just going to leave him to the tender mercies of ISIS? Or does he get involved despite the fact that he set a precondition?
Well, there certainly have been conversations going on between the White House and the government in Iraq. Vice President Biden has had a long relationship with Maliki. He's really leading these conversations. In terms of what the president said on Friday about making airstrikes contingent on a political process, there are obviously huge questions inside the White House about whether Maliki would make some of these political changes that he has refused to do over the past several years. That being said, there are options short of airstrikes that the U.S. could do, and it's unclear whether political plans in Iraq are also contingent on those options. That could be increased intelligence. It could be sending heavy weaponry to the Iraqis, which is also a dangerous situation when you're putting heavy weaponry into a situation that is so unstable.
Would you envision, if there is no political reconciliation, and when you talk about it with Chairman Rogers, he makes it clear how impossible that is to happen in a hurry. Could you see the president backing off and still getting involved in the absence of that kind of
in terms of airstrikes?
Yes.
I think it would be difficult for him to do airstrikes if we're going to go by the ground rules that he laid out on Friday without a political process, because then you basically have essentially either limited airstrikes that may not achieve anything or an open-ended commitment in a country that has no political basis for a real future.
I want to play a couple of clips of President Obama from just this week, which show how quickly he was forced to pivot in terms of his view of the situation around the world. Take a look.
The world is less violent than it has ever been. It is healthier than it has ever been. It is more tolerant than it has ever been.
I don't rule out anything because we do have a stake in making sure that these jihadists are not getting a permanent foothold.
Which leads to this very good question that we got from Scott Schultz on Twitter. The president always seems to be caught by surprise. Is anybody in the Obama cabinet responsible for contingency strategies? George, that was the course of 2 days between the world has never been safer to I don't rule anything out. How do you answer Scott?
Well, one does wonder, and we can hear from Jane on this, what we're getting, if we're getting value from the $50 billion we spend on all of our intelligence services. But General Douglas MacArthur said every military disaster can be explained by 2 words: too late. And it certainly is too late and fanciful to think that we're going to condition aid on vast political reforms in Iraq which are going to mollify these factions that have been at one another's throats for centuries. And Julie says you put heavy weapons in there. When they got to Mosul, the ISIS people, they didn't just empty the jails and the banks, they emptied the arsenals. 72 tanks they came away with, 700 Humvees, thousands of tons of ammunition that will now be fired at the government of Iraq. And just to give a sense of the humanitarian disaster that's engulfing the region, there are today more Syrian children of school age in Lebanon than there are Lebanese children of school age as the Syrian population scatters to neighboring countries.
Congresswoman Harman, as we discussed with Mike Rogers, this is our worst nightmare. We're not talking about a terrorist group, organization. We're talking about a terrorist army and possible state. How big a threat is ISIS? How much does it represent to the Middle East and potentially to the U.S. homeland? And I have to ask, how did President Obama let it get to this point?
Well, this started a long time ago with a guy named Zarqawi in Iraq, head of al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Who we killed.
And we thought that we had quieted down that particular group. A guy named Joby Warwick is now a scholar at the Wilson Center and is writing about this on the front page of the Washington Post. We thought we killed them, but they're back. I wouldn't lay this at Obama's feet. Remember that the Iraqis refused to agree to a status of forces agreement to keep us in Iraq. It's one of the reasons
there are
we left.
arguments about how hard President Obama pushed.
Well, okay, mistakes were made, and supporting Maliki, who is a feckless leader, Tom Friedman called him a jerk today. That's a little harsh, but hey, and unable to control his country is a bad thing. But I'm very worried about this. Mike Rogers is right that the training of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, we have to see this as one problem across the region, I think, not just in these national boundaries, is a threat to us. And they have clean passports, and the fact that an American was a suicide bomber in Syria is now part of their video propaganda campaign. And we have to have a much better strategy than we do across the region right now.
Julie, we've got about a minute left. What happens now? How long does this review go on? And the point that's being made, this isn't about protecting Iraq. This is about protecting the United States. I mean, the argument is it doesn't matter what happens to Baghdad. You can't allow this state, this terrorist state, in the middle of the Middle East. This is much worse than al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Right. Whatever the president does is not going to be framed as a U.S. effort to try to help the Iraqis. It's going to be framed as a U.S. effort to try to protect American interests, both in the region and eventually the homeland, because they say this group could strengthen and eventually attack the homeland. In terms of timelines on this, it's interesting because on Friday there was a lot of talk about we're going to be having to make a decision within days because of the gravity of the situation. But then you also hear at the Pentagon and from intel agencies that they simply don't have a plan yet. If we were to launch airstrikes, it's unclear what we would hit. So there is going to be, I think, a bit of a longer process to figure out, if you are going to take that option, what exactly that plan would look like.
We haven't mentioned Iran. And there's an alignment of interests, how bizarre is this, between Iran and us. They are threatened as we are, we in our homeland, but they in their homeland by the emergence of this ISIS group.
Of course, Iran wants an Iraq that tilts to Iran. We want an independent Iraq. So there's a limit to the alignment of interests. All right, we have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later. What do you think? Should the U.S. get back into the conflict in Iraq? Join the conversation on Facebook with other FNS viewers. Up next, an unprecedented defeat as House Majority Leader Eric Cantor loses a primary to his Tea Party-backed challenger. What does his loss mean for the GOP? We'll talk with two House Republican leaders on opposite sides of the split inside the party.
Our strategy to end the war.
We're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. The war in Iraq is over, and we welcomed our troops home.
President Obama repeatedly touting the end of the war in Iraq as a foreign policy victory for his administration, that is, before this week. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Britt Hume, Fox News senior political analyst. Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press. Syndicated columnist George Will. And director of the Woodrow Wilson Center and former Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman. Britt, I want to pick up on my conversation with Chairman Rogers. President Obama is pressuring Maliki to form a unity government, but on the other hand, as we've been discussing, Maliki seems to be doubling down on a Shia base, both reaching out to the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who's calling for the Shiite militias to form, to